At the minute, what I've done is I've created so schools and early years. Yes, yeah. So it covers all of the settings technically. Yes, yeah. So I'll remember the early years as well because that'll be slightly different. So ultimately, the only way in which we can keep our school environment safe is if we ask people who to not come to any of the settings, so that includes nursery, secondary school, primary school, if they have 5 conditions. One is that they are feeling unwell and they're experiencing the top 3 coronavirus symptoms, which, as we know, is a cough, and by that we mean a new cough or a worsening of a persistent previous cough, a temperature, and although they don't write it in the guidance, the actual temperature numbers, 119, which is the number that you call to book a test, have been saying the number 37.8, and there is more guidance that's been released suggesting 37.8. So that is a temperature that lots of are now using. And then also a loss of taste or sense of smell. We also wouldn't let people into settings if they've tested positive for coronavirus in the previous 10-day period. If they're sharing a household with anyone who's got symptoms, anyone who's got the symptoms, you would self-isolate for 14 days, but ideally you get them tested. Once the person has been tested, you can go back to your normal activities, but just in that period while they're waiting to be tested, you would self-isolate as if they were a positive. And we get a hell of a lot of inquiries about that, about when you need to self-isolate. And it's quite clear that you self-isolate when someone in your household has developed symptoms. So if it's a child, mom, dad, brother, sister, everyone in the house needs to self-isolate until they're tested and it's negative. If mom is feeling unwell, all of them need to self-isolate until they test negative, and so on and so forth. Everyone has to stay home until there's a positive result. Sorry, everyone has to stay home until there's a negative result, not a positive result. And then you also, when you're
Leanne, can I just ask a question, if I may?
Yeah.
So if someone in your household is symptomatic, everyone in the household isolates until the unwell person has a test result.
Yeah.
It's the unwell person bit that I think is confusing. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, until the unwell person has a test result and it's negative. Yes.
Yeah. Leanne.
Yes.
I think at some point in the last few days, a further symptom that was added to the list was fatigue.
That hasn't been officially dropped to me. Fatigue has been added to the list.
It's not officially on the list. All right, thank you.
That said, that in schools appears to be one of the most common symptoms I do come across. And then also in China, they have gastrointestinal symptoms as part of their case definition. So ultimately, it's different. But no, it is in my view, but I haven't had that handed down to me yet. But that said, overnight, when I finished work yesterday, I had over 100 emails last night. So I'm still catching up on the emails after I'd gone to bed. So I've got a lot to get through. So as far as I'm aware, that hasn't been added, but apologies if I'm out of date. And what I'll do is I'll update everything if fatigue has been added.
Okay.
So obviously then they've got the National Test and Trace Service. They call it Track and Trace because that's what it was called initially, but it's now called Test and Trace. And obviously if you're contacted by Test and Trace, then you've been in contact with someone who's positive, and you personally have to isolate for 14 days. Your household, again, can go about their regular day, can do whatever they want, but you yourself need to self-isolate if you've been in contact with a positive. And then finally, it's if you've returned from any country on the government list, you need to quarantine for 14 days. And it doesn't matter if you test and you test negative. We've had a lot of parents who've ordered home kits for when they got home off their holiday, thinking that if they then tested and got a negative test, they could go back to work and the child could go to school. That's not the case. If you're quarantined or if you're self-isolating because you're a close contact or because you've been abroad, then you need to complete the 14 days. It doesn't matter if you test and you test negative.
I think that's where some of the confusion earlier was coming from, when households are isolating because someone's feeling unwell and it's the person who's unwell gets a test result that's negative, then everybody's free. in terms of
isolating.
I think that's part of the difficulty. People are not realizing that and thinking that they can be finishing isolating earlier, and they can't.
And I'm aware of a school in Birmingham as well that had a positive in a class, and they sent the entire class home and told the entire class they'd need to get a test. So that's not the process. It's just to do with the close contacts. You go home and self-isolate. You only test if you have symptoms, if you are unwell. And obviously nationally, they're being quite clear that it's the top 3. But I'm personally finding that the top 3 doesn't cover everybody. And therefore, I don't moan at any school or parent who've took it on themselves to go and get tested, because actually that's where I've got most of my, a lot of positive cases from. So I don't recommend it. I will never say to people, I recommend you go and get tested or do anything. But if they take it on themselves that they felt unwell and they wanted to get a test, I don't say. But what we do say is do not test if you don't have any symptoms. And right. So that's how I kind of cover it. Okay, so in this toolkit then is 2 sort of letters, if schools wanted to use them, on remaining safe in secondary school and remaining safe in primary school. And this just covers all of those things that we just discussed around avoiding those people with symptoms and obviously to keep transmission low, getting tested, isolating those that are positive, and keeping risk of transmission to a minimum by sort of not mixing and isolating. So it's just a bit of a description. The only bit that's been different for the primary school to the secondary school letter, so obviously this doesn't involve nurseries, is a bit of a description about how schools are enacting different control measures in school. So things like if you're in secondary school, you may more likely be in your school form, and if you move from class to class, we are expecting people to keep seating plans. So that's in the secondary school letter. And in the primary school letter, it's more about staying in your groups, and that children may be playing in small bubbles that are coned off, and just kind of sharing that with them so that parents know what to expect. But that was available at the discretion of schools to use if they so wish. The bits that are probably the most useful are the PowerPoints in this. And by the way, if ever you want to use any of the documents, what you do is you right click, and there's normally, sorry, once you on these ones, oh, it's not showing it up here, but normally you can open them and right click on them and edit them, and then you can save them then from the sheet then, because a lot of people have struggled to get them out of the Word document. So, but you can right click on them once they're either open or beforehand, but I'll do that when I'm not presenting. So the first one is quick guide, should I isolate? So a lot of schools have said to me, I don't know whether I should be isolating or not. So this was quite a quick guide on, if I've tested positive for COVID, I isolate for 10 days plus 40 hours after a high temperature is resolved. If I've developed symptoms and I've not tested yet, yes, I must isolate. I've been told I'm a close contact of a case. Yes, I must isolate. A household member has developed symptoms and has not tested yet. Yes, I must isolate. A household member has been told to isolate as a close contact, but I don't have to isolate. So that's what's saying no. I visited someone within 2 meters who has now been told to isolate as a close contact. No, I don't, because we're a contact of a contact. I'm a close contact of someone who's tested positive. I've got tested, however, and I'm negative. Yes, you still need to self-isolate because you're a close contact of someone who has tested positive. My sibling is in another class and needs to self-isolate due to COVID-19 symptoms. I am in a different class. No, they don't have to self-isolate. My nan is unwell and I saw her 2 days ago. And it's a question of maybe, because if your nan is unwell and she tests positive for COVID, then yes, you'll need to self-isolate. If your nan is unwell and she's tests and she's fine, then no, you don't. So that's a maybe. So this was used on some school websites just to kind of make it a bit clearer to parents on whether they should or shouldn't isolate. And there's been numerous schools across the region who've now sort of shared something similar, and Greater Manchester have done one. And at the minute, I'm just agreeing with Katie Wilson and Richard Hawker on one that we can use to send out to schools that they can send on to parents. So that's just a quick on who should isolate. Does everyone get that? Is there anyone sort of
yes, and a good rule of thumb for me that's going to help me remember is the words you've just uttered about if it's a close contact that's been told to isolate, if you're a contact of a close contact, you don't need to isolate.
Yes, if you're a contact,
easy way to remember. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so the other presentation I've given is wrong one. Just give me 1 second.
Leanne.
Yes. Yeah. Carry on.
Is it worth flagging up that your toolkit is available to us all on the? I've put the link in the chat. And all the information that you're screening and displaying is accessible to everyone and members of the public if they want to access it, and that's being maintained and updated.
Yes, so it's available to everybody and anybody, and I've even shared it across the region as well, so everyone's got access to it. So yeah, some people are copying and pasting it and using whatever they wish from it. I've just said, if you find any of it useful, it's all in Word, I'm not precious, just carry on and use it. Okay, so the next one, can everyone see that refresher, what to do when someone has symptoms? So if you don't like my voice, then this is going to really annoy you. So it's on there and it's got an audio button, which will then start talking to you. So ultimately, this is quite simple in my view, because I think I've shared it quite a few times. So what I'm going to take out as part of the refresh, the bit about the symptoms. So normally, we would ask schools, if you've got a couple of kids who've got symptoms, let us know, because actually in the old, before September, anyone who had 2 or more symptoms, any school that had 2 children with symptoms, we would say, oh, that's the beginning of an outbreak, please get in contact with us. However, now that's not really the case anymore, because we've got schools with 7 or 8 kids off with symptoms and getting tested, and they're all coming back generally negative. So we're going to take out that little bit there in the update. So what happens if a child or teacher develops symptoms? So as we've just discussed, the household needs to isolate and you need to book a test. If that test is negative, then the household can stop isolating and they can return to school after 48 hours once they feel well. If the person tests positive, then they need to isolate for 10 days. They need to contact PHE. Obviously, that needs to change now because that'll be DFE. And they need to email dphadmin@warwickshire.gov.uk. And that may change it as well soon to the Education COVID email address. The household continues to isolate for 14 days. The setting then needs to start to work out who are the close contacts in the bubble. So this applies to nursery settings, primary schools and secondary schools. It's a lot easier in nurseries and primary schools because generally they stay in the same bubbles. But at that point, they would start to identify who are close contacts in bubbles and send them home to self-isolate. And the schools have a letter, and on that letter would say the start date, the end date, and what to do if they develop symptoms. So if anyone who is a close contact develops symptoms, then they need to book a test. And as we've described, anyone with symptoms who've definitely got the top 3, then the household need to self-isolate. So if you've got a cough, you've been informed you're a close contact of somebody, you're off isolating for 14 days. In that time, you develop a cough or a high temperature, or you lose your taste or sense of smell, then you need to recall your household, get them all back home, and you need to book a test. If that test is negative, then your household can go back to their regular usual activities. But as a close contact of someone who's tested positive, even though your symptoms were not COVID, you could still be self-isolating that period. You would still need to self-isolate because you could still be incubating the virus in that period. Obviously, if you test positive, then you follow the same rules. You need to isolate for 10 days. You need to contact, likely now, DFE, and then the dphadmin@warwickshire.gov.uk email address, and your household must continue to isolate for 14 days. So the whole point of why we create isolation is so that if people come out with all these symptoms, they're already at home, and then we just start to sort of make those links to make people stay at home. Is that seem quite clear? Is there any questions or queries on that?
Leanne, could you just, in a sentence, give us a definition of an outbreak now?
So an outbreak now is technically still 2 cases and that's confirmed
Positive cases.
Yeah. Two positive cases, and really that's an outbreak that we put the heading on is 2 cases. However, 9 times out of 10 those 2 cases are in the same bubble, and the second person who tests positive is already at home self-isolating. So although it's classed as an outbreak and it sounds like a really scary word, actually 9 times out of 10 they're really controlled. What I would define now as an outbreak, although it's not in any definitions by PHE, I'm sure it will change eventually, is whereby we've had a few cases in school, and by that I mean more than 2, and whereby there's links between them that's implicating different elements of the school. So, for example, one of the schools that we had, the 2 teachers were in the same bubble and the pupil was in the same bubble. So technically that's 3 kids, it's 3 members of a bubble that are off. Scary numbers and sounds really sort of, outbreak, but actually they're all in the same group. I would rather that than 3 people across the school that have links outside of school that we know of, but then also if there's any other children in the school that are off with symptoms, that's what feels to me as uncontrolled. So I guess it's the version of, is it controlled? Are they already self-isolating? To actually, is there onward transmission that we're not too sure about? And that's the difference in my view. But currently the typical definition of outbreak is 2 or more in a school.
So you would probably call that a bubble outbreak. So it is an outbreak, but it's only within the same bubble. But the real concerns would be if it's cross-bubble contamination for some reason.
Yeah, if it's cross bubbles, so the TA has been in 2 bubbles, but the TA was a contact of a first case in the first bubble. So they should have been off self-isolating, but they weren't identified as a link for whatever reason. Then they come out and it's actually later on it's found out that there was a link, and by then they've passed it on to another bubble, and now there's a child in that class that's tested positive. So it's just, you can start to see links that are not controlled, and that's my biggest concern, and that's when things get complex. But at the minute so far we've only had 1 school that has felt a bit complex, and then we've contained it. So it's just it's when it keeps going, I guess, when you get another one and then another one, and it's not in a bubble that's self-isolating, they're still in school. That's the bit that I get concerned about.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's covered the refresh on those situations. Then all that information, in case you're the kind of person who likes to read it, it's all here in text as well. The only bit that's on here that isn't in the presentation is this list here on some of the top symptoms around COVID. And this is around, these are other typical symptoms above the typical top 3. And this was produced actually in February this year by sort of the WHO on what they believed were the secondary top symptoms of COVID. So that might be where Kim's seen some information, but I don't know, there might be something further. Then also, what do we mean by close contact? And that's the bit that a lot of schools get really confused about. So a close contact is anyone who's had face-to-face contact for any length of time, which means that you've been generally within a metre. If you've been coughed on, a face-to-face conversation as I've discussed, and any unprotected physical contact, skin to skin. Although we wouldn't include in that whether you've touched hands, but it's more around sort of face-to-face physical contact. But if you had a child in a special school that were more likely to touch other children and touch them quite a bit and touch their faces, then on that we would start to class them as close contacts. But then to touch them, you need to be within a metre anyway for, to have that close contact. So generally, close contacts are within 1 metre, and definitely when they've been face-to-face and having a face-to-face discussion. The bit where it starts to get a bit more greyish is when you're over a metre, but within 2 metres. And that's when you've had a discussion with someone for 15 minutes. So it's about 10 to 15 minutes. If you're within 2 metres, but greater than a metre, you've got a leeway of about 10 to 15 minutes to have a discussion. Now, we don't have any guidance or any information on the impacts of sitting side by side, but not facing each other, but within 2 meters. We don't have any guidance on those who have face coverings within 2 meters. But what we do say is that the key ones are those that are definitely within a meter with a face-to-face discussion, and definitely within 2 meters having a face-to-face discussion. And so when we have discussions about the sitting on the buses and wearing face coverings and sitting next to each other wearing face coverings, then as long as they're over a meter, we start to have that discussion about how long, whether they have been talking and other bits. But that's when we had sort of the real grey areas. But mostly, most people can say that they weren't wearing face coverings, and that, you know, this, and in that instance, we just go with this as a guidance. The final thing of whether you've been a close contact is when you've been within a vehicle with a case. So if you sat within a car with someone who's tested positive, then we would self-isolate that person. Again, we've had some grey areas of, but what if they have the windows open and they're both wearing face coverings? Unless it's a PPE, like a fluid repellent face covering, we don't accept that as a mitigation. But, you know, it's one of those things of having those discussions on how long were they in the car for, and that kind of thing. But generally, if they're in a small car and they're travelling together, we class them as a close contact. Hopefully that makes sense. I can't hear any bings of any questions. So the next query is, how do I book a test? There's the national system and there's 119. And as everyone knows now, schools have got 10 kits, or I mean, most of them have used a lot of them now, but they can actually order kits online. I don't know how successful that is because I don't know how many schools have ordered them yet, but I'm hoping to hear in the coming days on that. So on the online system, here's the website here, or you call 119. We have had the 119 incorrectly tell people that because they no longer have symptoms, although they have had them in the last 5 days, that they can't book a test. This is not true. If you've had symptoms in the last 5 days, you can book a test. The only issue is that after 5 days, the test is no longer accurate because the chances of having the amount of virus in your nose and in your throat at the right concentrations to test positive is doubtful. So after day 5, we don't recommend people get tested. And as a result, we would treat you as your individual circumstance as a positive, and you must remain off work and off school for 10 days, and your household contacts have to continue to self-isolate. So some parents come back with like, well, that's fine then, I'm not going to get my kid tested. And they do get them tested then when you tell them, well, actually, if you don't get tested, then we'll have to keep your child off for 10 days. It's not just returning when they feel better, and you yourself must self-isolate for 14. When we inform them of that, generally they'll go and get their child tested. So you go on this website, you book the slots. Generally, it's every day after about 8 o'clock is when the next day slots are available. What I've heard is the biggest test centres are in like Oldham and Droitwich Spa and Scotland, or that's where the most availability is. So some people have been finding current that they're getting the test slots there. However, if you put in postcodes at different local authorities, so like Birmingham postcodes, definitely, different test centres come up. I don't know why they've done that. I don't know why they've contained it to certain local authorities, but some teachers have thanked me because actually they waited to 8 o'clock, put in a postcode, and they've been able to get tests at Edgbaston and Sutton Coldfield. So, which is a lot better than having to drive to Scotland. So you can book through as a drive-through test site or a walk-through test site or a home testing. The only thing that we warn people with the home testing is it can take 2 days for the test to arrive, 2 days for the test to go back, and about 2 days for the test result. So worst case scenario, you could be waiting 6 days for the result. And when that has an impact on a special school or a regular school, you know, that can create good delays on times that we would like to respond. So if people have means to a car, we would recommend that they get tested, because actually those results can be back within 24 hours, or at least they were before the current testing debacle. So I hope that explains that. I created a little bit of guidance about out of hours contact, explaining that schools should have out of hours lines and settings and nursery settings where people can report positives, and that's worked really well, whereby schools have had notifications of an evening or an early morning, and they've been able to action them before kids come to school. What to expect following a case. So this is really to say that is, you know, a quick guide for teachers. And the first things we need to do is prevent transmission, ensure children don't come to school and that they're tested as soon as they, you know, become unwell with the symptoms, and then identify close contacts. It's describing to them, you know, who are close contacts, because we would expect them to try and find them. So these are children who have been in the classroom within 2 meters, or children within bubbles, because generally in primary schools they do mix in the same as nursery settings. And in nursery settings and primary schools, it generally does include the teacher as well. So children who have sat within 2 meters of a positive case on a school bus, 2 meters within a positive case at lunch break, and if they've played together within 2 meters of a child who's positive. So obviously nursery settings and primary school settings, they can generally identify them. We're trying to keep the bubbles as small as possible and saying to people you can't play across classes. The more difficulty comes when it comes to secondary school, and we have mixed ability classes and different subjects. And in those situations, we're asking them to keep seating plans so we can track kids going from class to class to class.
Leanne,
yeah,
we've had head teachers raising the issue about their bubbles can be small, but they have to share toilet facilities, which is not really possible to clean in between visits. So I just wondered if you had any comment about that.
Yeah, so generally we're just saying that it's, as long as they maintain good hand hygiene, and that the hand sanitizer available as well, then that negates the need to. It doesn't negate the need to clean, but it negates the to have a concern on using of toilets and worrying about toilets, because that's whereby they don't want a child to touch a surface and transfer the virus from the surface to the child's face and hands and eye, you know, and that general facial area. And at the moment, that's, I'd say, the lower risk elements. But as long as they're washing their hands and sanitizing their hands, then that bit is of the lowest concern, and we just have to accept that as part of our risk assessments. And we're getting that a lot in all settings about the toilets issues and social care about their toilets. So in this situation, the first thing they do as well is to report it to DPH admin and then the health protection team. And obviously, since our notification, I think it was Tuesday, we just need to change these details to update them. And obviously, Ian's quite keen to keep this live document anyway, but I haven't had a chance to update any of these details. So they would gather the names of close contacts and start to inform them that they're a close contact. And the main thing there is the last time that they was in contact with the person, because they isolate for 14 days plus 1. So you isolate for 14 days and you return the day after the 14th day. So you return on the 15th day to school. So it's about gathering information in upper and lower secondary school, because obviously the how you do it in the lower secondary school when people don't mix is probably a lot easier than upper secondary school when you've got different subjects, and then also in nurseries and primary schools. And then we've got some letters to be sent to parents when you're a close contact, and letters to be sent to parents when there's been a case in school, just to remind them to remain vigilant. And then here is our levels of concern around cases. So if we've got 1 or more confirmed cases in a setting, if they're already off isolating, we've got quite low concern, just like I've mentioned really in the previous one. If we've got more cases and we've had to send more kids home, then we'll start to worry a bit more, so it's moderate. It's when we've got more cases in the school and it's not clear how much transmission is controlled and we've got more positive cases, that's when we start to have like an outbreak control team and start to pull it in to say, yeah, actually, have we done everything we need to in this situation? So if you want to look at those, they're all in there to go through as well, but I've already described them previously. Okay, so the next bit is really about preventing. Yeah, go on,
let's hope it doesn't go this far, but if it did, who would be on the outbreak control team?
So on the outbreak control team would be myself, the school head, and Public Health England, and generally Public Health England pull a couple of people in. But because at the minute DFE are just transferring them over to Public Health England, but it would be Public Health England.
All right, thanks a lot.
And it's the whole point of that is also a lot of heads and nursery settings in particular get really twitchy that we're going to shut them down or close them down. And so I make it really clear that when they have the conversation, it's about a dialogue between us and them and whether we all feel that the control measures in place are working. Because if we believe that they're not, then we need to take more actions. And it's for other people to triangulate some of that information so that it's not just relying on one person to make a decision. It's lots of people, so there's not a single point of failure and not a single point of thinking incorrectly. It gives everyone the opportunity to have more than one professional opinion in that ring. So it's really for lots of people. So Sonia, there's an early years PPI version of the yes Sonia amazingly took this and converted it for us, which was absolutely brilliant. And then I've been asked by a nursery, does a child who has been admitted to hospital with illness, including high temperature, treated as not COVID, have to isolate until COVID test back, or can? So if the hospital or a clinician has said it's not COVID, they've got I don't know, pneumonia, or they've got tonsillitis, then we take the professional's opinion who has actually seen that child. We don't override a professional opinion. However, if a GP has seen a child and the child has tested negative, we have had to go back to some GPs when the GP has then scared the parents, saying, well, it's clearly positive. They need to self-isolate. If the test is negative, then we go with a negative test. It's very rare that a test isn't working and comes up the wrong result. And so we always go with the test, unless there's a reason that the person is a specific specialist in the area and wants to override. But I've never had that happen where a specialist has overridden it. And then the same situation as if you've been working with someone and the GP has said it's clearly not COVID related and they haven't tested, then we would go with the GP's view in that point that it's clearly not COVID related. Okay. So in that situation, if the hospital haven't treated it as COVID and they're more hot on it than we are, then there's no reason why we would treat it as COVID. Okay, so the next one, and this is the last presentation I'll show you. So this has got my voice on it a lot. So this is really about setting up the seating plans and how seating plans work. So as you can see here, this is a seating plan with a child in the middle. If we have quite big classrooms, which we have in some schools, then we can potentially identify those who have sat together and those who haven't. And if you were only sat with that child for that one class over the period of the 48 hours, then you could potentially come back to school. And that has worked in some schools, but other schools, they've just sent the whole class home. So we could use the seating plans. And then what would happen would be that you'd identify if the child developed symptoms on the Wednesday, you only use the 48 hours beforehand. So you'd isolate anyone that was with on the Wednesday, anyone that was with on the Tuesday, and anyone that was with on the Monday. So if you went through all the individual classes using the seating plans and you knew that there were children that had sat away from that child, you could keep them at school based on that. However, the biggest issue that we've got at the minute is that secondary schools have got year bubbles whereby the children go out and play together and mix together in break settings and in lunchtime settings, and their fears are that they're in too many classes together and there's too much intermingling. And especially when we've had cases that have been quite popular children in school, that they know do generally mix a lot more with the rest of the year. The school has felt not very confident to just use sort of restrictive bubbles or restrict it down to a form. I am still working with schools and I'm hoping in the next week or so to go and do some site visits and have some discussions about how they can prevent it in future, because I don't think that they'll have just one case going forward. I think we'll have this dotting up and down within their school for probably the next 3 to 6 months. So it's how do we keep the kids in school as much as we can. And this is a way of doing break time. So break times can work two ways. Either you can have a control grouping whereby you only allow a form group into the canteen and then they go back to their classroom and eat their lunch, or you have very set ways in which they're in the canteen. So for example, or primary school, for example, whereby you only have a class sitting at a table together. They don't sit with other classes and then they go back to their regular classroom after. And then also, you know, the playgrounds are segmented off that you can only play within your class group. That's called control groupings. But if you have mixed tracing, this is where you allow your children to sit wherever they like, anywhere they like, and play anywhere. But you need to ideally keep like a checkboard that people can, you know, comment on as they walk in, write their name, say where, you know, the time that they were there, where they sat, and then mark out on their left. Or at some places like mosques, they have slips of paper that they fill in and they say, you know, who was in, they can drop it into the box of who was in which time slot. And so if they have any cases, what they do is they empty that box, literally go through everyone that was in that time slot having their prayer, and then where they were stood. And they isolate around that person. And I would imagine the mixed tracing is not a very popular option because it takes a lot of administration. I think the control groupings is the best way forward, but some schools haven't put in either. And that's where we're having a lot of kids having to go off to self-isolate because of not playing, because of playing together. And some schools have said, actually, since they've had their case, they've realised it's not that difficult to put in the control groupings. And since then, they've put them in and they've actually been quite popular with parents. So so that's that guidance. So the next ones are how to organise transport. So this is about if people were on a bus, how you would isolate children who are positive on a bus, and then also how you'd isolate the kids around them going forward. So if we had a positive on a bus, we would isolate those who are in the class with them, obviously, because as you do that in any class, and then we'd isolate everyone with a 2-metre radius. We've just done this recently where we had a positive in school who was then on a bus, and it worked absolutely beautifully. So we only isolated those who sat around the child and they all went home and self-isolated it, and it was absolutely great. So that's just some guidance on how we would do that. And then here are some templates to do the classroom template of putting where your child sat. So you can just move that around wherever your children sit, depending on the shape of your classroom. And then also, if you did want to use ticket stubs for people, there's a template there on how you do ticket stubs. This is the old version of the test and trace format of what it used to look like. If anyone wanted that, which basically is a more complex version of the presentation I've just given above, and then a little bit of info on cleaning. And then here are the letters that parents can, that schools can send. The one about children who are symptomatic. So we've got one letter for if you've got a child in your school who's symptomatic, just letting parents know. That was quite useful in June when we just had the one case. But now we've got like 6 or 7 kids off. Schools obviously don't want to send out 6 or 7 letters a day or give them like a running total of kids who are off. So that's optional now, and actually hardly anyone sends that anymore. And then the other 2 letters are, we've had a single case in school, but your child has not been a close contact and the school is open to them. And then the other one is, your child has been a close contact and your child now needs to isolate for 14 days and some of the instructions around that. And then there's a little letter here for when there is an outbreak in school, when that is needed to inform people. But obviously we're very cautious about sending that out. And also generally before this school year, a lot of parents would screenshot that and send that to the press. So we are very concerned about sort of that. And if you speak to any schools, we tell them not to speak to the press at all or put anything on social media other than to let people know that certain bubbles are closed, because it just creates issues and noise. But then also we're trying to move away from saying a single case or a single pupil or a single pupil in this year, because we have had a complaint from parents that they felt that they were witch hunted, and it was very upsetting for them. So for that reason, we're going to start to move away from individual case reports or saying there's a year 11 boy, that's had, that kind of thing, that anything that can identify anybody. So our polls need to leave. Okay, Kim, would it be a good idea to get the secondary heads or representatives to have a training session from Leanne? I've got one in 20 minutes. And I'm trying to get it more of it. So I do talk to the heads on a Tuesday, but yes, I'm presenting to the heads very, very shortly. So that's everything. So that was just a quick whistle stop of the toolkit. And yeah, oh, well, thank you very much, Zoe. I believe that as well, but can someone tell my husband? That's brilliant. So yeah, any questions or queries? That was very quick, but I think it's one of those things that you have to listen to it over and over again. And sometimes you hear it and you need to go over it. So you can go over it in your own time. And then I expect people to come back to me. And I've said this to the team I trained last week, that if you don't get it first time, that's totally fine. And if you're facing someone's question, you go, I know she covered it, but I cannot remember. I've obviously been living and breathing this for the last couple of months. So even I sometimes sit there at 7:45 and think I have no idea. I can't remember. I can't remember what I'm supposed to do. So questions. So we've got a hand up from Sue.
Hi Leanne. I've been working with the Education Leaders Helpline, sort of organising the rota for that, and also have access to the Education Corona inbox. So I'm just interested in, given everything you've told us, what's changing or happening there in terms of contacts with the helpline and with the inbox, because you did say, I think, that you were going to change the email address that schools were reporting to.
Yeah, so I've been speaking with Rebecca Bell on the flowchart for it, but yes, I just need to make sure that we've got it all set up. So it's changing soon, and all the guidance will be updated with it as well following that. So I'll pick that up with you after this, once we make those changes. So yeah, definitely.
Okay, so when are those changes predicted to happen? Because
imminently. It needs to be sent out sort of, it may have already been sent out, but it needs to be sent out very soon.
Debbie, you're on mute.
Just say, sorry, yeah, just to say that Rebecca Bell sent me a message during this to say that her expectation is the new system starts on Monday. So she's going to track that down, because there was some question about
Monday. There we go. Yeah, Monday. Yeah, someone's put a message in Monday.
Okay, because the helpline don't know that. We're not resourced to run it from Monday with these new volume of calls, and we don't have the staffing in place to do that. So I'm a little anxious now. Who do I need to talk to?
Well, we'll sort it out after this. It'll be a mix of, I think, Rebecca and the team, but we'll sort it out definitely after this.
All right, that's fine. I just don't want to.
Yeah, at the minute, the DFE have taken a large number of calls. So, I mean, I've had 3 missed calls during this presentation. But
yes, I appreciate that. And I know we need to
I generally have been quite quiet since the DFE announced their guidance, which I've been really happy about.
Yeah, sure.
Sarah T and Kim, apparently. Thanks, Louise. And then we've got any more questions? No, I think. Okay, great, because I only wanted to keep it short. So brilliant. Okay, any questions, you know where I am, and I'll run another one refresher next week again to go over the same things again, but just gives you a chance to sort of look at them. Great.
Yeah, could you share your documentation as well, because I don't think it is all accessible in that format online.
Okay, I will do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Share documents. That's no problem. I'll put it all in the chat box so you've all got it available. Great, cool. Okay, great. Well, have a lovely day and a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.